Be my husband for 90 days, then walk away clean. The contract was 8 pages. The part I kept reading was a single line on page 6, the one that said, "Emotional attachment constitutes a breach." I read that line 3 times standing in the parking garage of the Hargrove Tower on a Tuesday in February. It was cold enough that my breath showed. I had a hole in my left glove where the thumb meets the palm, and I remember thinking that was probably not the impression a man should make when he's about to sign something that uses the word indemnification. But I signed it. My name is Conrad Briggs. I'm 41 years old. I run a 2-truck landscaping operation out of Clover Hill, Virginia. I have a daughter named Lily who is 7 and who believes that worms have feelings and that the best breakfast food is cold leftover cornbread. I drive a 2017 Ford F-250 with a cracked side mirror I've been meaning to replace for 8 months. I am not the kind of man who signs contracts in parking garages. And yet. Here's how it started. In January, I got a call from a property management company asking if I could handle the winter maintenance on an estate in Albemarle County. Grounds cleanup, debris removal, keeping the drainage clear before the spring thaw. The property had been sitting empty for almost 2 years. I said yes, because January is lean, and lean January means a tight March, and a tight March means Lily doesn't get to go to soccer camp in April. The estate was called Meridian House. I didn't know who owned it. I didn't ask. The 3rd week I was there, a car pulled through the gate. Black, understated, the kind of car that doesn't need to announce itself. A woman got out. She walked the property for 20 minutes without speaking to me or my crew. Then she came to where I was clearing a collapsed section of stone wall near the east garden, and she said, "You're the landscaper." I said yes. She said, "Are you any good?" I said, "The wall will look better than it did when it was built." She looked at me for a moment. Not impressed, not dismissive. Measuring. Then she said her name. Catherine Voss. I knew the name the way you know, names that appear on buildings and endowments in the occasional news segment about someone who just acquired something large. I did not say that. I said it was nice to meet her. She came back the next day. And the day after that, by the end of January, she was bringing coffee. Not for the crew, just for me, which I found strange and said so. She said she didn't do things that didn't have a purpose. I asked her what the purpose was. She said she hadn't decided yet. The offer came on a Thursday. She called my cell at 7 in the evening while I was helping Lily with a worksheet about the water cycle. I stepped outside onto the back porch and stood in the cold in my socks and listened to Catherine Voss explain that she needed a husband. Not a real one, a temporary one. Her company, Voss Capital Partners, was in the middle of a merger with a European firm whose senior partners were, in her words, aggressively traditional. They had expressed concern, through channels, carefully so nothing was on record, about negotiating a 9-figure deal with an unmarried woman in her mid-40s. It was 2024, and it was also somehow 1954, and Catherine needed the optics to be different for 90 days. That was how long the due diligence and signing process would take. She needed someone who could present well, hold a conversation at dinner, and not sell the story to a tabloid afterward. She said she had done her research. She said she had chosen me because I was, in her estimation, honest, and because I had rebuilt a dry-stack stone wall to within 1/8 of an inch of plumb without using a laser level, and that suggested a kind of character she could trust. I stood on my back porch in my socks and said, "I have a daughter." She said, "I know. She can stay with your mother in Richmond on the weekends you're needed. You'll be compensated for your time and the inconvenience. The amount is in the document I'm sending." The document arrived in my email while she was still on the phone. I opened it. I looked at the number. I closed my eyes. I thought about the F-250's transmission, which had been making a sound for 3 weeks that I was pretending not to hear. I thought about Lily's soccer camp. I thought about the other thing I hadn't told anyone yet, which was that my largest commercial client had dropped me in December and I was down 40% of my annual revenue going into spring. I said I needed to think about it. She said, "Of course, I'll need an answer by Monday." I didn't sleep well that weekend. Lily crawled into my bed on Saturday night because she'd had a dream about a storm, and I lay there in the dark with her small hand on my arm and thought about what I was considering doing. I thought about my father, who had worked 31 years for a county road crew and died with his boots on and his name on nothing. I thought about what he would say if he saw me signing that document. I thought he would probably say something practical. He was a practical man. I called my mother on Sunday. I didn't tell her the details. I told her I had a temporary work arrangement that would require Lily to spend some weekends in Richmond for the next 3 months. My mother said she'd been waiting for an excuse to take Lily to the Children's Museum, and what kind of casserole should she have ready when they arrived. Monday morning I signed the page. The first dinner was a partner event at a hotel in McLean. Catherine briefed me in the car on the way there. Names, relationships, what topics were safe, what topics to redirect. She was efficient about it the way a surgeon is efficient. No wasted motion, no sentiment. She handed me a business card with my name on it that said, Conrad Briggs, Director of Special Projects, Voss Capital Partners, which was a title she'd apparently created that morning. I looked at the card for a moment. I said, Director of Special Projects. She said, You restore things, that's a project. I put the card in my jacket pocket. The dinner was fine. I spoke when spoken to, which is a skill I have, and I stayed away from anything political, which is also a skill. A man named Dirk, one of the European firm's representatives, older, silver tie, asked me how Catherine and I had met. I said we met when I was working on her property, and that she had come to see how the garden was doing and ended up staying most of the afternoon. All of that was true. I have a thing about not lying when I don't have to. Dirk seemed pleased with the story. He said it was romantic. Catherine said, Conrad has a way of making things worth paying attention to. She said it lightly, the way people say things at dinner, but I looked at her when she said it, and she wasn't looking at Dirk. She was looking at her water glass, and there was something in her expression that I didn't know what to do with, so I filed it away and talked to Dirk's wife about whether Virginia wine had improved in the last decade. The first weekend Lily went to Richmond, I drove her to my mother's house and hugged her in the driveway for longer than necessary. Lily patted my back. She said, Dad, I'm okay. Grammy has a new puzzle. I said I knew. She said, Are you going to be okay? 7 years old. She asked me that. I said yes, and I meant it, mostly. The weekends I spent at Meridian House, because Catherine had suggested it would be more consistent for the arrangement if I stayed on the property. There was a guest wing in the east side of the house. It had its own entrance and its own kitchen. She was careful about that. Careful about all of it. There were rules, understood rather than written, and one of the main ones was that the house had its own geography, and we each inhabited our section of it. But mornings, sometimes, she would be in the main kitchen when I passed through on the way to the grounds. And sometimes she would be reading, or on a call, or staring out the window at the east garden in a way that looked less like thinking and more like something she was waiting to stop feeling. I didn't ask. It was my arrangement to ask. March came. The ground started to soften, and I got back to real work during the week. Lily came home from Richmond with a half-finished puzzle of the National Mall and a very firm opinion about the Lincoln Memorial's relative importance. The weekends continued. The dinners continued. I got better at them. I started to understand the geography of those rooms, who deferred to whom, where the actual decisions were being made, how to read the conversation behind the conversation. Catherine noticed. She said, one night in the car on the way home from a dinner in Tyson's, You're good at this. I said, I grew up watching my father rent a room. He knew when the foreman was in a bad mood before the man walked through the door. It kept him employed for 30 years. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, What happened to him? I said he died. Heart attack on a Saturday morning, putting in a half day because the crew was behind. I said he was wearing his work boots. I said I had always thought that was the most him thing that could have happened, and also the worst. She said, I'm sorry. And I said, he didn't suffer long, and he never worked a day he was ashamed of. There was a silence that was not uncomfortable. Then she said quietly, almost to the window, I can't say the same thing. I didn't ask what she meant. I thought about it for 3 days. The thing about the glasses happened in late March. Catherine had boxes in the study. Things from her parents' house that had never been properly sorted after her mother died 4 years ago. She'd mentioned them once in passing, the way you mentioned something you've decided not to deal with. I wasn't supposed to be in the study, but I'd gone in to check a window latch that the caretaker had flagged, and I saw the boxes, and on top of one of them was a pair of reading glasses with a cracked left lens, sitting on top of a birthday card with the envelope still unsealed. I stood there for a moment. I went to the kitchen and got a piece of tissue paper, the kind that came wrapped around a bottle of olive oil that had been delivered that week. I brought it back. I wrapped the glasses. I put them in the inside pocket of the nearest box, upright, next to the card. I went back to the window latch. I didn't mention it. I forgot about it, almost. 2 days later, Catherine came into the east garden where I was working and stood there for a moment without saying anything. Then she said, "Did you wrap my father's glasses?" I said yes. She said, "Why?" I said, "Because they were just sitting there, and the card next to them hadn't been opened. And something that has a card that was never opened deserved to be put away carefully." She looked at me for a long time. Her face did something complicated that I did not try to name. Then she said, "Okay," in the tone of voice that people use when they're answering a different question than the one that was just asked. April came fast. We were past the halfway point of the 90 days, though neither of us said it out loud. The merger process was moving. There were 2 more dinners, one in D.C. and one in Charlottesville. And at the Charlottesville dinner, Dirk made a toast to lasting partnerships and looked at us when he said it, and Catherine put her hand briefly on mine. She did not move it away for a minute and a half. I counted because I needed something to do with my attention. Afterward, in the car, I said, "What's the status on the merger?" She said, "We'll be at the signature stage in about 3 weeks." I said, "So we're close to the end?" She said, "Yes." The word landed and neither of us did anything with it. On the drive home, I thought about the transmission sound in my truck, which had gotten worse. I thought about how Lily had started asking me on Sunday afternoons when we were going to go back to see the garden at the nice house, because she'd come to Meridian House twice now and liked the way the stone wall looked and had strong opinions about which section of it was the best. I thought about a lot of things that I did not say out loud. When we got back to the house, Catherine got out of the car and walked toward the main entrance and then stopped. She turned around. She said, "Conrad, do you want to come in? I was going to make tea." I had been staying in the East Wing for 2 months. I had never been in the main part of the house at night. I said yes. The kitchen at night was different than I expected. Smaller feeling, warmer. She made tea without asking what kind I wanted, and set a mug in front of me and then sat across the table and said, almost businesslike, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "Of course." She said, "Why didn't you take the money?" I didn't follow, and she saw that. She said, "In November, before I called you, the property management company offered you a full season contract at a rate that was 40% above your standard. You turned it down." I had turned it down because the terms required me to carry an additional liability rider I couldn't afford at the time. I said that. She said, "I know, I read the chain, but you could have asked for them to cover the rider cost. Most contractors would have. You just said no and kept the shorter contract." I said, "I didn't know what I was actually signing up for in a property I hadn't seen. The short contract gave me an out if it wasn't workable." She said, "That's not what most people would call a financial strategy." I said, "I know what I can do and what I can't. Signing on to something I'm not sure about costs more eventually than whatever I left on the table." She looked at me, and then she said something I didn't expect. She said, "I have spent 23 years building something that I am not certain I like." I didn't say anything. There are moments that require nothing from you except to stay in them. She said, "Voss Capital, the firm. It started as something real. My father built it from 3 people in a rented office in Roanoke. When he stepped back, I was 34 and I thought I knew what I was inheriting." She stopped. The merger goes through, and the firm becomes something else. Something that isn't his anymore, and I convinced myself that was just progress. That's what you tell yourself. Progress. I said, "But you're not sure." She said, "I signed a contract too, a long time ago, with a version of myself that believed scale was the same thing as value." She looked at her tea. I think she was wrong. I didn't have the answer to that. I told her so. She said, "I know. I'm not asking for one." We sat there for another hour. We talked about her father, a man named Gerald, who had apparently taught himself accounting from a library book, which I found deeply admirable. We talked about Lily, and I showed Catherine a photo on my phone of Lily standing next to the stone wall, giving it a formal rating with both thumbs. Catherine laughed, not a polite dinner laugh, an actual laugh, quick and surprised, and she looked at the photo for a long time. I drove back to the East Wing at 11 o'clock. I sat in the dark in the guest kitchen and thought that I was in a significant amount of trouble. The call came on a Wednesday, day 83. Catherine called me at 6 in the morning, which she had never done. She said, the European partners want to move the signing to this Friday. That puts us at day 86. I said, okay. She said, the contract between us expires at 90 days. I said I was aware. There was a silence. She said, I want to be straightforward with you. I said, you've been straightforward with me since the parking garage? She said, I want you to know that the terms were the terms. I'm not asking you to renegotiate anything. You've held up your end cleanly, and I appreciate that. I said, Catherine. She stopped. I said, what are you actually trying to say? A very long pause, long enough that I heard the birds starting up outside the east wing window. She said, I don't want Friday to be the last time I see you. I looked at the floor. The tile had a crack. I had noticed the second week and had been meaning to mention to the caretaker. Small things. The things you collect without meaning to. I said, I don't want that either. Another pause. Then she said, the contract says. I said, the contract says what it says. I'm not talking about the contract. Friday happened. The signing was at a law office in Alexandria. Dirk shook my hand and said, Conrad, whatever you are doing, keep doing it. She is a different person since last fall. I said thank you. I did not say that I was the one who was different, though I suspected we both were. Afterward, in the parking garage, not Hargrove Tower but the same quality of concrete and cold air, Catherine and I stood beside her car and she said, so, day 86. I said, day 86. She said, I have a condition. I said, another contract. She said, no, just a condition. She looked at me in the way she had been looking at me since March, the way I had been filing away and not naming. Lily has to approve. I said, that's going to be a high bar. She has opinions. Catherine said, good, so do I. The week after, I brought Lily to the garden. She walked the full length of the stone wall and stopped at the section I was most proud of, the corner where the stone stepped up at a grade, and she put her hand on it the way I've watched her touch things she is deciding about. She looked at Catherine, who was standing nearby, respectfully patient in the way she had learned to be patient since March. Lily said, did you know my dad built this? Catherine said yes. Lily said, the rocks are bigger on this side because of how the ground goes. He explained it to me. Catherine said, I know. He explained it to me too. Lily thought about this. Then she said, you can come have dinner with us on Tuesday. We have tacos on Tuesday. But you have to not be weird about the salsa because it's spicy and Dad says it's non-negotiable. Catherine looked at me. I said I did say that. She said, I like spicy salsa. Lily said, okay, and then she went back to examining the wall, which in her assessment was the more important thing, and she was probably right. I don't know how to explain what that moment was. I could tell you it was small. It was. Lily and a wall and the Tuesday dinner. But I have learned, more than once now, that the small things are the ones you're actually building with. The rest is just scale. I make a decent living. I know what I am capable of. I know what I can't do and what I won't do. And the line between those two things has kept me standing through enough winters that I trust it. Some things you build slow, and they last. Some contracts expire, and what was underneath them turns out to be worth more than what was on the page. That Tuesday, Catherine Voss sat at my kitchen table and ate tacos and did not say anything weird about the salsa, and Lily told her, very seriously, that the worm you find after rain has the same nervous system as the one you find in dry ground, which means they feel the same amount of things, and Catherine listened like it was the most important thing she had heard all year. Maybe it was. I still have the cracked tile in the East Wing kitchen. I never mentioned it to the caretaker. I don't know why I kept it to myself. Maybe because some things you notice quietly and they become yours in a way that's hard to explain. That's what I keep coming back to. The things nobody sees you do are the ones that actually build you. I wrapped those glasses when nobody was watching. I turned down a contract I couldn't honor. I stood in a parking garage in a cold February and read a line about emotional attachment being a breach, and I signed anyway, not because I was reckless, but because I knew what I was and wasn't capable of, and I trusted that line more than I trusted the money. That's not wisdom I learned from a book. It came from watching my father work 31 years without cutting a corner he'd be ashamed of. Character is a slow thing. You don't build it in one decision. You build it in 100 small ones, most of them when nobody's looking, most of them when it would be easier to do the lesser version. I think about what Catherine said that night in her kitchen. 23 years building something she was no longer sure she believed in. That is a particular kind of loss. Not the dramatic kind, not the sudden kind, but the slow erosion that happens when you keep choosing scale over substance and wake up one day holding something enormous that doesn't feel like yours anymore. She was smart enough to see it. That took real honesty. Most people aren't willing to sit at their own kitchen table at 11 o'clock and say out loud that they were wrong. I wasn't in a position to fix any of that for her, but I could stay in the room while she said it. Sometimes that's the thing that matters. Lily asked me once, on the drive back from Richmond, whether Catherine was going to be around for a while. She asked it the way kids ask things. Direct, no softening, just the actual question. I said I thought so. She thought about it for a mile or two. Then she said, "She listens when I talk. Most people wait." 7 years old, she already knew the difference. I have thought a lot about what made any of this possible, and I keep landing on the same three things. Not qualities I was born with, things I had to work at, still work at. Knowing right from wrong, and actually doing it even when it costs you something. Thinking clearly about what you're signing up for. Reading the room. Understanding that the conversation behind the conversation is usually the one that matters, and just staying standing through the winters, not driving, sometimes. Just not quitting, because Lily needs lunch money and the truck needs to run and spring always comes. Those three things, the doing right, the thinking straight, the not giving up, I don't think they're qualities you either have or don't. I think they're things you practice, like a dry stack wall. Every stone depends on the one under it. You don't rush it. You don't skip the ones that are hard to place. You level it by hand, a little at a time until it's something you're not ashamed of. Lily rated my wall 9 out of 10, said I lost a point because there was a gap near the top corner she could fit her whole fist through. I went back the next week and fixed it.